Whenever I think of Nana Mac, I can smell the kerosene. Let me explain. Nana Mac was my great-grandmother, and on Mother's Day we used to go and visit her. She lived alone in a small, poor house with a metal tin roof and cement sheet cladding. It was very simple, and I was always worried about her in winter because it seemed so cold. And in the middle of her living room was a small kerosene heater with wire mesh aglow, and the smell of kerosene filled the room. It's a very strong memory. We loved our great-grandmother. She was a special person, a person of few words, but always spoke the truth with love. There was an incredible transparency with Nana Mac, integrity, clarity, and when she spoke, she was usually right. And the older I got, the more I realised what great value that was. For various personal reasons, Nana Mac brought up my mother, so she raised my mother. And looking back, I realise now that Nana Mac's sense of personal integrity, her commitment to the truth, enabled my mum to survive and to eventually thrive. We owe Nana Mac a great deal. Now, I'm conscious on Mother's Day, it's not a great day for everyone. There are many people who had terrific mothers. There are many also who had terrible mothers. There are many who live in families where there's violence and poverty and injustice. But there are a few people, a few gems like Nana Mac, stars in the constellation who shine through as great women, maybe even as early feminists. Because of their personal integrity, she lived with and by the truth. I want to explore the notion of truth, and in particular what it means to live by the truth. And in order to help this reflection, I want us to think about, just for a moment, about the Gospel of John. Truth works in the Gospel in two ways. There's a religious dimension. Jesus is presented in this Gospel as the one in whom truth is disclosed. In his person, divine truth is revealed. But there's also a very strong ethical dimension. That is, that the Gospel presents an ethic for living the way of truth. And it happens at two levels. First of all, the language itself. I mean, the noun for truth is frequently used in the Gospel. But there's a certain kind of speech which is also referred to. It goes back to a Greek word. In an anglicised version of it would be parasia, but it's more correctly pronounced parhasia. And that word refers to a certain kind of speech, fearless speech, courageous speech. It's usually translated in the Gospel of John, and it's used about 6 or 7 times in the Gospel, as speaking openly or plainly. So this notion of Jesus speaking openly or plainly, speaking the truth openly or plainly, threads its way through the Gospel. In a sense, he acts out this ethic of living by the truth. But there are also stories which focus on the theme of the truth. The classic story comes in the trial scene towards the end of the Gospel, where he's before the governor Pilate. And in this first encounter with Pilate, there's a climax where Jesus makes reference to the religious dimension of truth, that he confronts with Pilate with this notion that in him the divine truth is disclosed. And Pilate responds with that famous retort, "What is truth?" And there's something about the tension between the religious disclosure on the lips of Jesus and the cynical, ambiguous response of Pilate. It's as though this is the heading for the whole Gospel, that there's a struggle going over the meaning and significance of the truth. So remember, this is a couple of generations after the time of Jesus, and we have a fractured community living in the shadow of Roman violence, trying to determine the nature of Christian leadership and the nature of Christian living. And very close to the heart of that is this whole debate about the meaning and the nature of truth. And so stories thread their way through the gospel, which have this encounter with truth. A classic version of that story, of course, is Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman. It's a remarkable story. In many ways, the Samaritan woman is an early theologian. She meets Jesus as an equal, and they debate about the nature of faith, the nature of worship, and the nature of truth. Jesus discloses the truth of her life. Not in a judgmental way, but it's as if to say, well, this is the truth of your life. And in that, there's a deeper level of engagement. She respects Jesus for what he has seen and the regard with which he holds her. It's a remarkable story because on the surface, they're debating theological issues. But really, the nub of the story is, what's the truth in your life? And by accepting transparently the truth of her life, she becomes in many ways one of the early evangelists as she goes back and proclaims the significance of this Jesus that she has encountered. So here we have the Gospel of John, in which the theme of truth is central. Truth is disclosed in and through the person of Jesus, but there is the spelling out of an ethic, of a way of living, which is about a courageous and committed attitude to truth. That truth is not some idle or metaphysical concept. It's something that we commit ourselves to and we live out. Now, this theme, this ethos, this way of living the courage of truth seems a timely theme. In the age of the virus, there is much confusion. There is uncertainty about what the new normal is going to look like. But there are also important ethical issues at stake. There are important social justice issues at stake which also relate to the question of truth. If I can just give 3 examples. If we take the case of victims of child abuse, numerous churches failed, numerous church leaders failed on this issue. Now, first and foremost, it was a failure of compassion, not to be moved by the complaints and the people who were making them. It was a failure of compassion. But secondly, it was a failure of personal integrity, that various churches and church leaders were not committed to the way of truth. They disregarded the truth for the sake of vested interests or fear of causing conflict and controversy. The second example belongs to our friends in the queer community. Many gay and lesbian, intersex, transgender, bisexual people know what it is not to live out the truth of their lives. There's a cost when we live in secret, when we live in the shadows and do not live out the truth of our lives. We now understand better than ever that when a person feels it is the right time and the right place to come out, that this is a profound decision. It is a decision of liberation in which that person is now ready and able to live out the truth of their lives. The other example that is becoming more and more prominent is that there seems to be in a number of places, I'm thinking of Australia, United Kingdom, America, where there's a rise in racism. And what often happens in the face of racism is that people retreat. People who are victims of racism, one response is to almost try and become invisible, to live in secret, and to no longer live out the truth of our lives. We live in an era which I think is searching for an ethic for living. And what I'm suggesting today is that the courage of truth, a wholehearted commitment, a passionate committed to living transparently and with integrity is what is needed. We need it at the political level. At the moment, we get so bombarded with empty political rhetoric. And behind this rhetoric, there's a desert, a vacuum. Now, I'm not saying for one moment that questions of truth are easily discerned, that the truth is something out there in black and white. But it's about our politicians and our leaders being passionately committed to working with integrity and openness, having the courage of truth to seek out the truth so that that commitment to truth infuses our politics. It's also relevant at that deeper and personal level. It is Mother's Day, and there are many people, many families that are broken families. Not every family had a beacon like a Nana Mac. There are families where there's heartache, where there's secrecy, where there are invisible ones. And whilst it's a very painful thing, unless we reach a point in our lives where we want to accept and face the truth of our lives and be committed to it, we'll never be happy. Moreover, we will struggle with all sorts of guilt and anxiety because we're living in the shadows. The courage of truth. In the ancient world, it was a highly respected tradition because someone who lived the courage of truth was someone who was willing to take risks. They were committed to it. They were willing to put themselves in the public square at the risk of being misunderstood, even persecuted. But he or she knew that a life that wasn't committed to the courage of truth was no life. This ethic of truth, this ethic of living by the truth, we see practiced in and through the life of Jesus and spelled out very clearly and powerfully in the gospel itself. And it's liberating. Often when there are stories of truth like the Samaritan woman, the person's life is transformed. The burden of secrecy, the burden of living in darkness has been removed. And so it is no wonder that the truth in the Gospel of John is seen as something that will set us free. It's powerful. It's liberating. And the world needs the courage of truth. And it begins very simply with us having the courage to look at our lives and to take the first step. Dear Nana Mac, I can see the galvanised roof, the cement sheets, and I can smell the kerosene. And as I reflect on those powerful, palpable memories, I feel a sense of gratitude. She gave my mum and our family a remarkable gift. The gift of truth, the gift of living the way of truth, the courage of truth. In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer and Sustainer. Amen.